Okay, guys. So, welcome to the Combat Sports Physical Preparation presentation. My name is Henry Pike. I'm the head coach of Pike Performance. And today we're just going to look at basically my thoughts and my kind of systems that I use for the fighters that I coach. So these aren't all things that I've come up with or I've invented. Really, they're things that I've learned from other coaches, certifications, and just the general experience that I've had working with combat sports athletes. So the overview we'll look at. So first off, we need to think about the foundation. So what are the most important things when training athletes, but also really when training anyone? So we've got what I would call the combat athlete conundrum, and how we understand our kind of our population. We've got the big rocks, so stress and adaptation, and these are the things that are going to apply to everyone. You know, anyone that you train, from Gen Pop to professional athlete. And then we've got the training week, and again, this is very pertinent to athletes, but especially pertinent to combat sports athletes. So it's that managing total training load, that melding of strength and conditioning and skill training, which people get wrong a lot of the time, and that really is a big problem. So then we're going to go on to the methods. So we're looking at assessments, why and how, a data-driven approach. So the metrics that I like to observe and keep an eye on with my athletes, and why we're doing that. Periodization, how we structure people's training. Looking at the how we focus on strength training, so the strength training component of the work that we do with people, and how we structure that. We're going to touch on aerobic work as well, and whether we should be focusing on aerobic work and the benefits of that if we are. And then we're going to look at sports specificity, and then we'll just touch on recovery methods at the end because it is so important. I want most of this to be about training, really, but we can't talk about training if we don't talk about recovery because they're so interlinked. Okay, so the combat athlete conundrum. This really is an issue that I see a lot of people really failing at the first hurdle because they don't understand their athlete. And they don't understand what makes a fighter and how to utilize the positive aspects of what fighters bring to the table and how to deal with some of the negative aspects that they bring to the table. So the attributes are as follows. Yeah, mentally very tough. You know, if you've got someone who likes being beaten up and beating other people up, they're going to be used to adversity. Fairly well conditioned when it comes to aerobic work, majority of the time. Good body awareness, like being able to learn a skill that is basically how to move your body around in different positions and, you know, to move other people around in different positions, should give you a fairly good awareness of kind of where you are in space and time. Generally, you know, there's always outliers, but I would say probably more often than not, relative strength's fairly low. So they're good aerobically, strength-wise, not as good. A very busy competitive calendar. So until we get to the upper echelons of the UFC and ONE FC and Bellator and things like that, generally people are going to be trying to amass a very good record. So you might see people competing, you know, anywhere between 5 to 10 times a year. So that gives us, you know, another issue that we need to kind of think about when programming. Probably due to that, but also due to the fact that people are very mentally tough and people just really love training. They are very prone to overtraining. And historically, there's been a view of like the kind of do more attitude and let's work harder. And the other guy's going to be there, so working hard. So we need to outwork him. So this overtraining kind of mentality is very, you know, commonplace in MMA and jiu-jitsu to a degree. Or any martial art. And that moves on to the next point, that there is an overvaluation of hard work. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need to work hard, because we do need to work hard. But we don't always need to work hard, and we can get a lot of positive benefits from moderately hard work or or low intensity work, there's a lot of benefits to be had. So from skill acquisition to, you know, conditioning, we don't always need to work at 100%. So we need to kind of get that. We need to really drive that message home to our fighters. But this is going to vary, obviously, because you might come into contact with a fighter who, you know, at the amateur levels, who doesn't really like working hard and needs to be pushed. So we need to kind of tailor that message to our athlete. Yeah, and we've spoken about this undervaluation of lower intensity recovery work. So we'll look at that later in the line. But again, that can't be undervalued because it's so important. And then we have this more complex issue that we're not going to touch on too much today, but it's certainly worth mentioning, that we have this kind of disordered binge eating and exercising pattern because of the weight cutting that is involved in the sport. And it's really easy to kind of see this, even with well-intended athletes who don't really realize they're doing it, but, you know, doing a lot of extra cardio and extra movement to deal with the fact that they've eaten a little bit too much the day before, and restricting food, and then binge eating after, you know, after the fight and things like this. So you definitely see this kind of reward culture, but also this disordered binge eating and exercising pattern culture in the sport. And it's just something that we need to be aware of, because if you're going to be training combat athletes, or if you aren't a combat athlete yourself, it's something that we want to be keeping an eye on, because it can lead to problems later down the line. So the big rocks, stress and adaptation. The general adaptation syndrome is what we're working with here. It was discovered by Hans Selye in the 1930s, and it's talking about the way that our body responds to a stressor. So there's 3 stages. The alarm stage, so the introduction of a stressor, triggering our fight or flight response, which is active when we're doing exercise. Adaptation or resistance stage, so our body then learns to adapt to the given demands that the stressor puts upon it. So, you know, bicep curling a 10 kilo weight, after a while that becomes easier because our body is adapting to those demands that we're asking it to do. And so next time we're gonna need to lift that 10 kilo weight. It's getting easier and easier. And then if we don't, you know, have adequate recovery, we're getting to this exhaustion stage. So we're slowly becoming kind of overtrained, and that's leading to this reduction in performance and inability to function. So we can actually use this exhaustion stage, if we're careful, to actually get some really good training effects, but we need to be careful with it. And again, it's something that we need to monitor. So this is one of the other big factors that we need to think about when training MMA guys or fighters in general of any sort of discipline, is the total training week. So if you look at here, we've kind of written down what I think is not a dissimilar potential, you know, week for any kind of MMA athlete. So we've got 2 boxing sessions, 2 kickboxing sessions, 2 grappling sessions, 2 MMA skill sessions, 2 sparring sessions, 2 strength training sessions, 2 aerobic conditioning sessions. So that's a lot of sessions. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 sessions. That's 2 sessions a day. I don't think this is necessarily, that's quite a lot, but it's not necessarily uncommon. And you may look at that and say, well, I don't do that much. I only do, you know, I do 3 MMA sessions, I do 1 grappling session, 2 sparring sessions, 2 strength training, and a run. But that's still a lot of training. So we really need to make sure that we have a system for managing that. And the system that I tend to use is categorization of sessions. So we would look through someone's whole training week, and we would say, look, let's categorize all your sessions into either high intensity, moderate intensity, or low intensity. And what governs whether something's high, moderate, or low would be how easy it is to recover from it. So the really hard sessions, sparring, max effort strength training, certain conditioning methods, they're going to be in your high. Sort of skill-based sessions, lower intensity kind of grappling sparring, and kind of more dynamic effort, or some certain, conditioning sessions might be moderate. And then your recovery sessions, your shadow boxing, your drilling could be down in that low intensity bracket. So having a system around this is going to be really important. Looking at someone's, let's say, pre-morbid personality, if you like, not their personality, but their, certain aspects of what makes them, their training history, all these sort of things that comes before the MMA. This kind of builds a picture of their tolerance to stress, how much they can cope. A good example of this is, two guys, same age. One's been training since he was 4 years old in different martial arts. Another guy starts when he's 30. They could be roughly the similar levels of fitness, but that guy who's been training since he was 4 years old, he is probably going to have a higher tolerance to being able to train more frequently and harder than the guy who starts when he's 30. So things like training age matter, experience matter, pre-morbid stressors matter. Whether someone has had stressful events happen in their life, whether someone doesn't manage, mental stress very well, doesn't manage their lifestyle very well. All these things matter in terms of managing the total stress load, which includes exercise, family life, work, everything that might cause a stressor in their life. So all these things matter. They need to be considered. So that, other factors, like I just mentioned, full part-time job, family, girlfriends, friends, hobbies, kids, whether they're prioritizing massage and physio and all this sort of stuff, if they're professional athlete, press, those, responsibilities, these things matter in terms of how much stress we can throw at them from a kind of S&C standpoint. So the foundations. Athletes are tough and resilient, but they are prone to overtraining. This is MMA athletes specifically. And they're also often guided by what has worked historically. So, what did their predecessors do, and this is often what the coaches are advising them to do. So rather than looking at, okay, let's look at what's going on in current best practice in sports science, which probably should be guiding some of our decisions. Athletes need to recover from their training. If they don't recover, they're not getting the adaptations that they want. And if they're not getting the adaptations they want, they're not going to be able to perform at the highest level. And athletes are potentially overworking with the perceived amount of training required to perform at the highest level, leading to increased risk and subpar adaptations. So really what we're saying here is people think that they need to work potentially more than they actually need to work to get the best adaptations to become the best fighter they can become. Now, again, this message I would always tailor to the person, because some people are going to be prone to overtraining. I think probably most MMA fighters will be in that bracket, but some people aren't. So we need to kind of make sure with those people that we're really pushing them. So some factors to consider when thinking about conquering the combat athlete conundrum. Assessment. We need to make sure we're assessing. We're not assessing, we don't really know what the athlete is capable of. So we're looking at aerobic fitness, strength, movement capacity, things like this. We get that baseline down, and we can really get an idea about how to program for that person, where to guide them, how to guide them in terms of getting the best out of their performance. The data that we use is going to be really important for a long-term assessment. So not just getting that baseline, that long-term assessment of, okay, we're using certain methods with this guy, with this fighter. What's it doing? So with subjective measures are important. Him telling us he's feeling good or he's not feeling great, he's tired, he's not sleeping well, all this sort of stuff, like giving us feedback, readiness scores, things like this. But if we can use some objective measures, that's maybe the collection of the two things, objective and subjective data, really gives us some good data. So things like heart rate variability, resting pulse, blood pressure, if you've got sleep tracking kind of capabilities using sleep trackers, all this kind of stuff gives us this really, undeniable data that you can make great decisions about whether someone's ready to train hard, whether they should be taking a day off, whether they should be focusing on recovery methods that day. You know, this is the beauty of modern kind of science and modern technology, is we can really get some great numbers to tell us exactly what someone should be doing on that day. Periodization. So rather than just coming in and flogging the same thing every week, week after week, month after month, every session, just training hard, we need to understand about structuring their volumes and intensity of their training, not just for their strength and conditioning work, but also for their skill work. Understanding there needs to be some thought about how hard are we training today and how long are we training for. You know, there needs to be some thought, and hopefully if you have a good skill coach, they'd be thinking about that. And I know certainly where we're stationed down at Gym 01, the skill coaches are factoring that in. But this is so important, and ideally we'd get skill coaches and S&C coaches communicating with each other and trying to marry up the kind of periodization of the skill work and the strength and conditioning work. That's where you get some really great results. And then the last thing is recovery. Ensuring your athletes understand how to recover and the level of importance is stressed. My little dad joke for you there, but we can't stress it enough that managing stress is very important. And that's not just mental stress, that is every stressor that gets introduced into an athlete's life. Understanding how to manage that is really key to getting high performance. So the assessment. When we establish a baseline, we will be looking at a lot of different things. So the big hitters, obviously aerobic fitness and strength. Aerobic fitness will get a few measures. We'll be looking at VO2 max potentially, resting heart rate recovery after kind of hard effort. We might even look at like blood lactate and things like that if we had the equipment. So there's lots of different things you can do depending on what kind of equipment you've got at hand. Strength, you know, it depends on the experience of the athlete. If someone's very inexperienced with weightlifting, maybe new to the MMA, we might just look at like some body weight drills, which is really looking at more sort of movement quality. You know, how many press ups can they do in a minute? You know, how many air squats can they do in a minute? Sit-ups, things like this, like really basic stuff. Let's watch them lunge for like 10 steps one way, 10 steps the other way. We can get an idea like whether there are any potential imbalances coming up, weaknesses anywhere, and kind of just get an idea kind of, you know, where they're maybe a little bit weak and what needs working on. If we've got somebody who's a little bit more experienced, we might look at testing their kind of 5-rep maxes on their squats, you know, deadlifts, presses. Really, my kind of assessment protocol would be dictated by the person, not necessarily applying a one size fits all approach in this respect for strength assessment. We might even look at like, you know, get the push band going and look at whether they are kind of force or velocity dominant. You know, what do they need to work on? Do they need more power work? Do they need more strength work? So it depends on the athlete essentially. But we would certainly want to have some information about their strength and their aerobic fitness. In terms of their lifestyle, we'd want to be looking at, you know, are they a dad? Are they a mum? Are they, you know, a young single guy? Are they working a lot? Do they have a job? Are they like an aspiring professional athlete who's throwing all their eggs in that basket and really trying to make a go of it? You know, have they previously had, you know, any kind of mood problems or kind of physical problems, injuries? You know, we need to know about all this stuff from their background to get an idea of how to coach that person and an idea about what we need to be telling people or the kind of focus that we need to be moving towards in terms of getting the best out of that person. A lot of people nowadays are using kind of dedicated nutritionists, but it's something that I would touch on with people. And if you're just watching this and you're an athlete yourself, your nutrition is, I shouldn't have to tell you this, but your nutrition is going to be vital in terms of your recovery, in terms of your performance. So, you know, getting some idea about how well people are eating and then supporting people to understand what they need to be doing and how they need to be consuming their foods, when, what, why, all this sort of stuff to get their best performance. You know, we're not going to talk about that really today. That would be another talk, but it's certainly something we'd be looking at focusing on. Again, so like we spoke out earlier, we'd be filling out their planner, we'd be looking at their training schedule and trying to like organize their training as the best way possible. So whether we need to make adaptations to that or not, we'd be looking at that and building a system around their kind of lifestyle. And like I said before, with the strength and aerobic fitness, the movement quality assessments, we'd be looking at kind of imbalances and whether there's anything that needs to be addressed in there that might lead to injury later down the line. So we touched on it before, but we will use some data to keep an eye on our athlete, if you like. So we might use questionnaires. If I see someone frequently enough, we can do this in person. But we might ask people to give us kind of subjective data, like, you know, rate of perceived exertion on their sessions, how they're generally feeling. Do they feel like they could be doing more or less, or do they feel like they're getting run down or unwell or overly sore, all these sort of things. But we'll also ask people to collect some objective data. And this is the stuff that I really love, and I've seen some good results with people. So heart rate variability, or HRV, is an objective measure of how we manage our nervous system. So are we sort of well recovered from the stimulus that has previously been applied the day before or the day before that? You know, are we more towards our kind of parasympathetic nervous system? Maybe we're still, you know, in deep recovery and we need to give ourselves a bit more time before we start applying hard stimulus again. Or are we more towards the the sympathetic side of our nervous system? And we're still really like reacting to the kind of stressors that have been applied. So we want to get a balance between those two. Generally, we want to probably be a little bit more parasympathetic than sympathetic, but we certainly want to strike a balance. And using apps like Elite HRV, we can get these kind of readiness readings, and we can use these to kind of dictate how ready you are to train on that day. Resting heart rate, again, is another good, or waking heart rate is another good objective measure of readiness. Not quite as good as HRV, but certainly we will see kind of increases in heart rate if we're still really like, you know, in that recovery mode or still really reacting to kind of a stressor. So we'll certainly see increases in resting heart rate. But also over time, we can use this as a kind of trending marker, and we can look at whether someone is, you know, peaking, is really there, is ready, like as their resting heart rate coming down, is their cardiovascular health and their aerobic fitness really like high, and we're seeing their heart rate coming down, and this is a really great measure that we're moving in the right direction. Same for blood pressure. Wouldn't use that as often because it obviously requires a blood pressure cuff, and most people don't use those. But certainly at our initial assessment, and potentially we would check back in on it to make sure that people's blood pressure isn't getting jacked up through their training. Sleep data is another great one. There's a lot of different apps and bits of kit that you can use to manage people's sleep and kind of get an idea about how well people are sleeping. And so this is something that we would really want to focus on, is to make sure people are sleeping well and getting good quality sleep. So having some data around that to kind of give us a bit of feedback about how well they're sleeping is very useful. And we've already spoken about rate of perceived exertion. So yeah, we touched on this earlier, but the HRV and the resting heart rate, they can really be useful in terms of tracking the impact of high volumes of training on our nervous system. And this is really important. I think if you can get a strap, like a heart rate monitor, or sometimes they do like finger clip things from Elite HRV and things like that, that can help to give us this HRV reading in the morning. It really gives us an idea about whether we're ready to do hard training the next day or that day. And you might wake up and think, I feel absolutely fine, but my HRV data is actually saying I'm not so great. And when you're getting moving throughout the day, you notice that, like, walking up and down the stairs is a little bit more challenging, and just generally getting a bit puffed. When you're moving around, you think, okay, like, if I didn't have the data, I might just go in. I just think, stop being a pussy. I'm just going to train and just train hard. But now I've got that little number telling me that I'm not ready to train as well. So maybe I'm just going to kick it back a little bit. I'm going to go to training, but I'm going to take some easier rolls, and I'm not going to, try and win every round. And the next day we come back and, our HRV's come up a little bit, and I actually feel a bit better today. So we've made a better training decision because we've kind of auto-regulated our intensity based on that number. Whereas before, if we didn't have that number kind of holding us a bit accountable to our recovery, we might have just said, "I'll push through, you're just being weak." But it's not always the case. And I think using the numbers can be a good learning tool for a lot of fighters who often struggle to kind of pull back, when they need to. But there's all these benefits, and really we are reducing that injury risk, potentially improving the quality of training. Although we're pulling back on that day, it might be that actually you have to pull back on that day, and maybe another day, Wednesday and Thursday, we pull back, but we're sparring on Friday, and then we're there and we can spar hard. So that session is quality, and we are sparring hard, and we're not using, all our kind of energy on those two less important days on Wednesday and Thursday, because actually we had the data and we knew that we were going to pull back on those days because we weren't ready to train. And really it meant that we can actually train harder more frequently, rather than just hoping that we're going to feel great on our sparring days. We'll get better results because we're driving recovery. Better recovery is going to mean better adaptions and better results. And certainly this is going to mean that we're probably going to be able to train for a longer period of time, across the board. That longevity is going to be improved. So super important for maintaining a nice long fight career.